Now let's take a look at the hardware requirements for SQL Server 2008, because obviously when you get ready to install SQL Server, you need to make sure that your hardware has the appropriate functionalities, capacities in place to run this. Now, let me warn you, this is a little bit silly, but if you're going to take any of the certification exams, you need to know this, and you need to be able to regurgitate it back to Microsoft, because they will ask you questions about this. First of all, Microsoft is going to tell you that the minimum is a Pentium 600 megahertz or higher processor. Now, that's the minimum. The recommended is going to be 1 gigahertz. Now, if you're starting to install SQL Server on a Pentium 600 processor, you may have some issues that you need to talk to some nice man about, okay? But for 1 gigahertz or higher is what Microsoft's recommending. But again, if you're taking a certification exam, you could see a situation where they'll ask you a question about an installation, and because of who knows what, they're trying to stick this thing on a Pentium 500, and that's not going to be acceptable because that's below the Microsoft requirements. So anyway, you'll have to watch for those kind of things on the exam. On memory, it's the same thing. It requires 512 megabytes. If you've got a server with only 512 megabytes available for SQL Server, then you need to get some more memory. So the recommended here is 1 gigabyte or more. Obviously, 1 gigabyte's okay, but you need a lot of memory to run SQL Server. So the more, the better. Express Edition, take note, requires 192 megabytes and recommends 512 or more. Now, Express Edition, this is not quite so ludicrous, because a lot of times we may be installing an application that's running on an end-user machine or something like that. So those may look more realistic. Now, the disk space for SQL Server is based on the components. Now, the full database components are 280 megabytes for the database, but understand, let me back up here. Microsoft divides the various functionalities of SQL Server up into components, and you can install those individual components based on what you're going to do with SQL Server. So if you're not going to do business intelligence, you don't have to install business intelligence. So you have fewer things working, fewer things running, smaller footprint, less things exposed out there for security problems and so forth. So just kind of watch as we go through here. To make this thing be a database server, it's going to take 280 megabytes for all your database components. If you want to do analysis services, OLAP, data warehousing stuff, that's going to be an additional 90 megabytes of disk space on the install. Reporting services is going to take roughly 120 megabytes of disk space to install. Integration services, or the data movement, the data warehousing, data copying, ETL tools, are going to take about 120 megabytes. The client components are going to take about 850 megabytes. So you need to keep these in mind. Again, in the real world, you're not going to install a database on a server and wonder if you have 280 megabytes of space there, because there's some other problems, right? But on the exam, if you take any of these certification exams, you need to be aware of these numbers, because they will ask you about them. And again, they're just trying to make sure that you understand the hardware requirements, because it's surprisingly common to see administrators out there install this on machines that don't have the proper hardware requirements. And so that's one of the first things you always want to check before you begin to install something, that you have the proper hardware in place to run this product and to get functionality out of it and efficiency that you actually need. So anyway, there's the hardware requirements. Kind of treat them like legal requirements. Just kind of know these if you go into the exam.